Fighting in a medieval battle, you must understand, was not the glorious, heroic spectacle depicted in movies or romantic literature. It was instead a nightmare of terror, pain, and chaos that pushed human beings to the very limits of physical and psychological endurance. Medieval warfare was brutal beyond modern comprehension, and those who survived to tell their stories described experiences that would traumatize even the most hardened modern soldiers. The night before a medieval battle, historians tell us, was often sleepless for most combatants. Long before the first sword was drawn or arrow loosed, soldiers had endured a nervous night. They often slept in the open or took refuge inside cramped tents, if they held rank. Many suffered from lack of food or clean water. Some vomited from fear. Others sought calm by praying or by reciting stories of past glories. The pre-battle atmosphere was thick with dread, anxiety, and the knowledge that many of the men sharing rations and stories around the campfires would be dead before the sun set again. Medieval soldiers, unlike modern troops, had no illusions about the nature of combat. They knew that survival often depended more on luck than skill, and that death in battle was frequently slow, agonizing, and inevitable. Medieval armies, you see, were composed of men from vastly different social backgrounds, and their battlefield experiences varied dramatically based on their equipment, training, and position in the social hierarchy. Knights, heavily armored and mounted on war horses, fought a very different battle than common foot soldiers, who faced combat with minimal protection and primitive weapons. The morning of battle brought its own unique terrors. As dawn broke, soldiers could see their enemies across the field, and the reality of impending violence became inescapable. The sight of opposing armies, thousands of men armed and ready to kill, was psychologically overwhelming for many combatants. Medieval chroniclers described men weeping, praying desperately, or even fleeing before the battle began. The battlefield itself was often a muddy, treacherous landscape that made movement difficult and dangerous. Medieval battles frequently took place after rain, creating conditions where men slipped, fell, and were trampled by their own comrades. The ground, churned by thousands of feet and hooves, became a quagmire of mud, blood, and human waste that made every step a struggle for survival. The opening phases of medieval battles typically involved archery exchanges that created scenes of incredible carnage and terror. Soldiers understood that standing still under fire meant suppressing the sight of men collapsing nearby, unable to move or breathe. Many blocked arrows with shields or helmets, but others fell before they could raise a weapon. The sound of arrows hurtling through the air and the sight of a sky filled with a rain of death created an atmosphere of terror and helplessness. Medieval archers, particularly English longbowmen, could loose 12 arrows per minute, creating storms of projectiles that could devastate enemy formations before hand-to-hand combat even began. Armies facing longbowmen often had to endure a continuous barrage of arrows, watching their comrades fall one by one, while being unable to retaliate effectively until they closed to melee range. The psychological impact of archery was as devastating as its physical effects. Men had to watch friends and brothers struck down by arrows they couldn't see coming, from enemies they couldn't reach. The randomness of archery deaths, the way arrows could kill a heavily armored knight as easily as a peasant footman, created a sense of helplessness that broke many formations before they could engage in close combat. When infantry finally advanced to close quarters, the pace quickened, and the lines began to blur into chaotic, individual struggles for survival. Medieval melee combat was not the elegant sword fighting depicted in popular culture. It was brutal, exhausting, and often decided by strength, endurance, and sheer determination rather than skill with weapons. The reality of medieval hand-to-hand combat was that it was primarily stabbing, crushing, and grappling rather than the graceful blade work of Hollywood fantasies. Medieval weapons, battle axes, maces, warhammers, and short swords were designed for maximum damage in close quarters, where men fought so close together that sophisticated techniques were impossible. Medieval combat was also incredibly loud. The clash of metal on metal, the screams of wounded and dying men, the roar of battle cries, and the thundering of cavalry charges created a cacophony that was both terrifying and disorienting. Many survivors described the sound of battle as unlike anything else in human experience. a wall of noise that made communication impossible and added to the psychological trauma of combat. The smell of medieval battlefields was another assault on the senses that modern people can barely imagine. The stench of blood, human waste, fear-induced sweat, and rotting flesh, combined with the smoke from burning equipment and the dust kicked up by thousands of combatants, created an atmosphere that was physically nauseating and psychologically overwhelming. Medieval armor, while providing protection, also created unique challenges for combatants. Knights in full-plate armor could survive sword blows that would kill unarmored men, but they also suffered from restricted vision, limited mobility, and extreme physical exhaustion. Fighting in 60 pounds of metal armor was incredibly demanding, and many knights were as likely to die from heat exhaustion as from enemy weapons. The psychological experience of fighting in medieval armor was complex. The protection provided confidence and allowed for more aggressive tactics, but the isolation and sensory deprivation created by helmets and faceplates could be psychologically disturbing. Knights described feeling cut off from the world, able to hear only their own labored breathing and the muffled sounds of battle around them. Infantry combat in medieval battles was characterized by the formation fighting that required incredible discipline and courage. Shield walls, phalanx formations, and pike squares all depended on men standing shoulder to shoulder with their comrades, maintaining formation even when friends were dying beside them and enemies were trying to kill them with spears, axes, and arrows. The essential elements of success in infantry combat were seen as good order and a tight formation, not individual heroics or sophisticated weapon techniques. Medieval foot soldiers had to suppress their natural instincts for self-preservation and maintain their positions in formation, even when retreat seemed like the only rational choice. Medieval cavalry charges were among the most terrifying experiences on any battlefield, both for the knights participating and the infantry receiving the charge. Mounted knights, thundering across the battlefield on 1,200-pound war horses, created psychological shock that could break enemy formations before physical contact was even made. The experience of receiving a cavalry charge was described by medieval chroniclers as like facing an avalanche of steel and horseflesh. Infantry formations had to stand firm against opponents who towered above them, who could strike down from horseback, and who could trample fallen men under the hooves of their war horses. The medieval knights' experience of cavalry combat was equally intense. Charging into enemy formations required incredible courage, as horses and riders were vulnerable to spears, arrows, and other weapons specifically designed to stop cavalry attacks. Knights had to trust their armor, their weapons, and their horses' training, while riding full speed toward men who were trying to kill them. Medieval battles were also characterized by their unpredictability and chaos. Plans made before battle rarely survived contact with the enemy, and combatants often found themselves fighting in situations they had never trained for, against opponents using tactics they had never encountered. Communication during medieval battles was primitive and unreliable. Commanders relied on horns, drums, banners, and shouted orders, but in the noise and chaos of combat, these signals were often missed or misunderstood. Units frequently became separated from their commanders and had to make tactical decisions based on local conditions rather than overall battle plans. The duration of medieval battles varied enormously, but most lasted several hours, during which combatants had to maintain their fighting effectiveness despite physical exhaustion, psychological trauma, and the constant threat of death or serious injury. The physical demands of combat in heavy armor with primitive weapons were enormous, and many men collapsed from exhaustion before they were killed by enemies. Medieval medical knowledge was primitive, and battlefield medicine was virtually non-existent. Wounded men often had to continue fighting or crawl away from battle under their own power. Many who survived the initial combat died later from infections, blood loss, or injuries that would be treatable today, but were fatal in medieval conditions. The aftermath of medieval battles was as traumatic as the combat itself. Victorious soldiers stripped fallen enemies of armor, weapons, and anything else valuable, but they might also ravage a conquered village or city for supplies and booty. The systematic looting that followed many medieval battles created additional opportunities for violence and brutality. Medieval combatants also had to deal with the psychological aftermath of battle. what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder. The sights, sounds, and smells of the battlefield were overwhelming. The screams of the wounded, the stench of blood and fear, and the chaos of men and beasts locked in mortal combat created psychological trauma that could last for years or even lifetime. Medieval society had no concept of psychological counseling or treatment for combat trauma, so survivors had to cope with their experiences, using whatever personal or religious resources they could find. Many turned to alcohol, others to religious devotion, but there was no systematic support for men who had been psychologically damaged by their battlefield experiences. The social consequences of medieval battle were also significant. Men who had fought together formed bonds that lasted lifetimes, while those who had fled or failed to perform courageously faced social ostracism and loss of honor that could destroy their lives and their families' prospects. Medieval warfare created a warrior culture that glorified combat while simultaneously recognizing its horrors. Knights and professional soldiers developed codes of conduct that emphasized courage, honor, and loyalty to comrades. But these ideals were often tested to the breaking point by the brutal realities of medieval combat. The frequency and intensity of medieval battles varied depending on the political climate and ongoing conflicts, but many professional soldiers fought in dozens of battles during their careers, accumulating physical and psychological damage that affected them for the rest of their lives. Medieval battles were also seasonal affairs, typically fought during spring, summer, and early fall when weather conditions made military campaigns possible. This meant that combatants had months to contemplate upcoming battles, to worry about their survival, and to prepare mentally for experiences they knew would test their courage and endurance to the limit. The weapons technology of medieval warfare was specifically designed to cause maximum damage to human bodies. Swords were designed to cut through muscle and bone, maces were designed to crush skulls and shatter limbs, and arrows were designed to penetrate armor and cause internal bleeding. Every aspect of medieval military equipment was optimized for killing and maiming human beings as efficiently as possible. Medieval combatants also had to deal with the sight of incredible carnage and brutality. Battlefield medicine was primitive, so wounded men often suffered for hours or days before dying. The screams of the wounded and dying were a constant background to medieval battles, adding to the psychological trauma experienced by survivors. The randomness of medieval combat was particularly disturbing to participants. Skill and courage could improve a warrior's chances of survival, but luck often played a decisive role in determining who lived and who died. Men could fight bravely and skillfully for hours, only to be killed by a stray arrow or a lucky blow from an inexperienced opponent. Medieval battles were also complicated by the presence of non-combatants, camp followers, servants, and others who accompanied armies but were not trained soldiers. These people often became casualties during battles, adding to the chaos and increasing the psychological trauma experienced by combatants who had to witness the deaths of civilians. Understanding what it was like to fight in a medieval battle requires recognizing that these were not the romantic adventures depicted in popular culture, but rather experiences of extraordinary brutality, terror, and trauma that tested human beings in ways that few people today can imagine. Medieval combatants were not heroes in the modern sense. They were survivors of experiences that would challenge the strongest and bravest individuals in any era of human history.